Welcome back to CityCast. I'm your host, Ananya Yadav. This is episode 6 of CityCast's Resilient Cities series, and in this episode, CityLAB students Derya, Demirci, Challen, Wendy, Zhang, and myself continue our conversation with Danielle Koleyak, who is an environmental project manager at the City of Edmonton. In the last episode, Danielle shared the successes and challenges of setting up a climate change adaptation and resiliency strategy plan in Edmonton. She talked about conducting community engagement and the importance of interdisciplinary teams. In today's episode, Danielle speaks about the importance of bringing about a cultural shift and building partnerships in the community. Without further ado, we'll dive right into the conversation. I just had a question regarding one of the points you made about, for example, the research grants and things like that. So what do you think is the importance? Because I know climate work, a lot of times it's all about capacity building within the cities itself. So what is the importance for you as a city to reach out to some of these, for example, U of A or other academic institutions, or even outside from academic, local nonprofits, for example, that are already doing climate work in Edmonton? What is the importance of that to build a larger capacity and maybe also then get a larger support for climate work in the city?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head right there with being it's to build that larger capacity and larger support. And I know for academic institutions, for example, I do agree there needs to be a lot of capacity building within the organization, but a lot of times there's just not the time to do the research or even the access to so if you're talking for example climate modeling, we don't have supercomputers that we can use for that. So even just those types of kind of technical pieces. But I do think a big part of it is just, like you said, making those connections and tying it all together. We have some groups in the city that are working with vulnerable populations already. And we already partner with them on end poverty and that type of stuff. So why not work with them? Because they know the communities, they know the concerns and the issues. So let's work with them and figure out, is climate going to impact them? And then what can we do to help build their capacity to manage that? So yeah, I think it is really important and kind of on connecting all those players, which is not easy to do. But yes, I think it's exactly what you said, is building that broader capacity. It depends on the partnership, but I'd say that is most of it is funding and advertising too. I do know so our team doesn't partner directly with NGOs per se. We're a bit more, I guess, internal, but some of the other teams that do, some of them do actually have partnership agreements, and they actually will work on things kind of jointly together. So they might be on boards or that type of stuff. So it definitely does vary, but I mean, a lot of it, sometimes it does just come down to being funders. Yeah.
I was just wondering quickly, I liked what you said about the visuals, and it got me thinking, are there any unique challenges that Edmonton faces based on the fact that it's relatively northern compared to the other cities we've spoken to?
I would say so we're not north enough that we have to deal with things like permafrost and that type of stuff. So that's good. I'd say a challenge, for us, is more in the way that people are well, climate change won't actually be that bad in Edmonton. It's there's no sea level rise, and it's oh, getting warmer, that's really good. I like heat, so I think that's not a challenge. And then trying to show them what that, heat might look like, okay, because our winters are warming quite quickly. So we did a historical assessment looking at the past 100 years of recorded Environment Canada data, and our winters have already warmed at 3.5 degrees Celsius per century. So it's quite a rapid rate of warming. So even telling people hey, that means that things like mountain pine beetle, for example, can survive the winter, and we can get infestations in our forests, or things oh, with the warmer winters, we're getting more freezing rain and rain on snow, and that's contributing to accidents and all of that type of stuff. So I'd say our challenge is more of trying to get people to understand that, yeah, maybe it doesn't sound that bad, but it does change how we build and how we interact with our city and our environment. So yeah, and I mean, we are lucky that we don't have to worry about permafrost or sea level rise, for example. But we're also dealing with, those events like the extreme rainfall events that we never really used to get that often. So more flooding, those types of things. Yeah, so I'd say those are more of the challenges of getting people to understand that it's not all good.
I just had a quick question. So I was wondering what sort of cultural shift you have to create. So one cultural shift, I guess, is acknowledging climate change, but perhaps maybe something like what sort of things do you have to change about how citizens and companies operate? So like maybe the amount of waste they reuse, or I know Hamilton has like a huge car culture, shifting away from cars, or any other areas that are relevant.
Yeah, that's there's a lot, I would say, culture shift that needs to happen here. We have a huge car culture here. Like, I don't own a car, and it's very challenging to get around without one. Um, so there's a lot of culture shift. I think too, for us, being on the prairies, there's this perception that we can just keep building out and out and out and out as a city and contribute to that car culture, contribute to building a really expensive city, because that's a lot of money to maintain and operate expansion, and also just taking over of great farm agriculture land. So I'd say there's a big culture that needs to happen of like, you don't necessarily need a huge house far away, you know what I mean? Like, you can have a smaller space, and that, so that's a big culture shift for us that we're dealing with. And I think too, for climate change, I think a big one too that is just helping people deal with the uncertainty of it all, because climate modeling and everything like that, like, it is model, it's not, it's not, you're not seeing the future, you're just modeling it. And so all models are wrong, but some can be useful. So helping people like understand that we just have to deal with this uncertainty and the increased in instability and of our climate system. I think, because I work a lot with like engineers and stuff, and they want that certainty, and I understand it, because they're trying to design for something to withstand, a certain threshold, but it's trying to get that culture shift of things are going to be a bit more erratic, and it's going to be a bit more volatile, and we don't really know what that means, but we have to figure out how to work within these new, I guess, bounds. So that's just another piece of the culture shift that we're trying to get here. Yeah, but yes, I would definitely say the transportation and land use one is big here.
So just on that, then the cultural shift, who do you guys look to when you're developing new strategies? Because I know when we were talking to Vancouver, like, he was saying how, they saw an idea from New York, and then they implemented it, and then Toronto had an exact replica of it. So I was wondering, for Edmonton, like, who do you guys look to if the source is like external, or like, I know you said a lot about internal ones, but yeah, if you could just like touch on that a little bit.
Sure. So yeah, so for us, at least our team, we I guess look aspirationally. So there's this organization, I'm not sure if you've heard of it, called C40 Cities, and it's kind of like mega cities that are working on climate change. So it's the cities like, New York, London, Tokyo, Paris, Melbourne, not at all contextually similar to us, but we do look towards kind of those cities as inspiration. It's like, oh, look, they're doing this really innovative thing. Is there a way we can adapt it and modify it for our context? So I'd say we look at that, and then we also do still look at like our Canadian counterparts. We look a lot at Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal as well, and we try to look at other cities that are, I guess, contextually relevant. A lot of the C40 cities, for example, are dealing with sea level rise, which obviously we're not. So we try to figure out what are other places. So yeah, I'd say we definitely look aspirationally, and then on the other side of it, our council is always asking us what Calgary's doing. So we're always looking at Calgary, whether for like to be like, oh, they're doing it too, or to be like, oh, they're not doing it yet, let's do it before they do it. So I'd say, and we actually work quite closely with our Calgary colleagues who also work on this work. I'd say we kind of, yeah. So
Yeah. So when you mentioned all those cities, have you guys actually implemented any of the strategies that you were inspired from, like, or is it just like, oh, that's cool, like, or
yeah.
on the process of like implementing it, like, has any actually been implemented or strategies been used from like those cities you mentioned?
I would say we're trying. We're trying. So I guess an example would be, New York has their climate resilient design guidelines. So we're trying to integrate into our existing design guidelines, but we've already determined that if we can't get that, we're going to develop our own design guidelines. we prefer to integrate into the existing ones so it's not so confusing for developers. There's not so many different ones there. Yeah, and we're also trying to do a green roof program or policy, potentially similar to Toronto. We're not quite sure. So we are trying for some of those. And then on the kind of other half of climate resilience and the energy climate change mitigation side, we're just updating our strategy for that right now. And I'd say a lot of the actions we've identified in our updated action plan are ones that these C40 cities and stuff are taking. So we're trying, but it kind of goes back to that kind of culture shift piece too, that it's, yeah, it can be challenging.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess another question. I just have some questions that I actually, like, when I was researching just some of the programs that you guys have, I was wondering if you know a little bit about the corporate business leaders program.
So part of that program is what they call the corporate climate leaders. And that's really where they've tried to bring in some of those businesses that are already doing great sustainability initiatives. So like IKEA, for example, is one. I think they've got Atco Gas, which is our natural gas utility. They're doing some interesting work. So they kind of bring in those types of players to showcase their work and also to, I guess, help build capacity for other businesses in the city. And then there's also, as part of that, they hold like workshops and they invite other business sectors in to kind of listen and learn and talk. So I'm not entirely sure of all the details, but I think it's just to kind of help businesses connect to each other almost more than anything else.
So just like share best practices and like knowledge and stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it.
Okay, thank you. So I know earlier in the beginning you mentioned the energy transition strategy plan, and when I was taking a look at the Edmonton page, it was like two different. Is it like two different ones? Like the climate change plan is one plan and then the energy transition plan is another?
It is, yes.
I was wondering if you could elaborate more on what the energy transition plan is, like in relation to the climate change plan.
Yeah, sure. So the energy transition plan is really our climate change mitigation plan. And they are two separate plans. And part of that actually is because we have a City of Edmonton charter regulation, and the charter regulation states we have to have a mitigation and an adaptation plan. And we just got advice. We were just advised that it's easier if we just have them a separate document. So that's part of the reason. The other part is that they were developed at different times. So it was just, a bit better to keep them kind of separate. But so myself and my colleague who did the adaptation plan were actually the ones that are doing the update to that strategy. So we're able to still link in different climate resilience kind of pieces. And I think in the implementation, we're going to try to kind of look at resilience more holistically and not just adaptation mitigation separately. But energy transition plan, so it's our mitigation plan. As I mentioned, we're doing an update to it right now, and that was based on a council motion in August of 2019 where they declared a climate emergency, and they wanted us to update the plan to be aligned with the Paris Agreement, essentially, of limiting average global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So our update of that plan kind of we looked at our GHG emissions profile, and we have, I guess, 4 kind of big buckets of work to do. And so one of those is around renewable energy systems. One is around emissions neutral buildings, because our buildings are big GHG emitters, and partly because it is cold, so we have to heat and that type of thing. And then we have another big bucket around low carbon city and transportation. And then even our GHG modeling indicates that even after we do all of these actions, we're still going to be left with a big piece of our emissions profile. So our last one is around carbon capture and storage and nature-based solutions, so that we can actively draw carbon out of the atmosphere. And of course, nature-based solutions work is very much a co-benefit with climate change adaptation. So we're trying to figure out how we can kind of work on both and make sure that actions aren't, that they're not, what's what I'm looking for, like dichotomous to each other. And actually, when they were developing the strategy initially too, they did a bunch of policy briefs, and one of them was looking at climate change mitigation and adaptation, to basically look at making sure that our actions aren't going to maladapt us to climate change, for example. So there still was, even though there were separate plans, there still was connections were
Yeah.
still being drawn.
Okay. I'll just move on to like more of the public engagement questions we have, and then we could just wrap up. I know you mentioned that the community was more like educating them for the plan, but were there like, I was curious more on like, were there actually at-home initiatives that Edmontonians can actually do? Because I know for Portland, they have like things that the residents can do at home, and they have like a backyard habitat certification program and stuff like that. So I was wondering if Edmonton has anything like that that residents could take part of to help with climate change and action plan goals.
That's really cool. So I don't think at this time we have programs like that. I want to learn more about the backyard habitat certification program, but we do have like information, I guess. So we have, so our whole kind of climate change branding is Change for Climate. And so under that, we have like what we call Change Homes for Climate and Change Habitats for, or Change Habits for Climate, sorry. And those are different documents that basically have tips and tricks and advice for people. So we have that kind of information that people can use to take actions at home. And we also have what we call a climate resilient virtual show home. And basically it's an online tool that homeowners can go to and look at different climate hazards and what they can do to basically harden their house to those hazards or mitigate against those hazards. So yeah, so right now I'd say it's mostly still the information out. We do have, on the energy side of things, we do have some maybe more programs on the adaptation side. So we have there's an Energuide labeling program, and there's, I think, a solar rebate program still. So there's kind of some of those things. On the adaptation side, we're not quite there yet. It's still more of that information out at this point.
Yeah. Sorry, what is the labeling program? What's that?
Yeah, so and now my information might be a bit outdated. They might have altered the program a bit since, but I believe it was like if you got an Energuide assessment and you posted your assessment, you were able to get a rebate that could go towards doing energy upgrades, essentially, to make your house better. Yeah, and there also is there just was announced a couple weeks ago, so I don't know the details of it, but we have a Home Energy Retrofit Accelerator program, and I believe that's also another kind of grant program for homeowners, more on the energy side of things. But yeah. And one thing I should mention too, so in Edmonton, our entire water utility is owned and operated and managed by EPCOR. And EPCOR has a big program around urban flooding. And through that program, they also have some homeowner programs, so like a backwater valve program. And I believe they're doing some like maybe flood like audits of homes and that type of stuff. So they have their own programs as well that are still very much adaptation programs. Yeah.
Okay. So I guess another question we could ask is, how did the city of Edmonton engage with like Indigenous people to ensure that there's mutual respect? And like when you guys were making decisions, like, sorry, I messed up the question. How do you engage with Indigenous communities to ensure mutual respect when making decisions that affect their communities and the environment?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. And so we have an Indigenous Relations Office at the city, and they kind of guide and they provide guidance and help us kind of determine all of those decision points. So we also work quite closely with Enoch Nation. They border the city of Edmonton corporate boundaries, and so we work very closely with them. But it really does depend on what we're doing. And so I'd say because we haven't started implementing a lot of the actions yet, we haven't done a lot of Indigenous engagement yet, but that will happen. But yeah, we kind of rely on the advice from our Indigenous Relations Office.
Yeah. And the stakeholders that you mentioned in the very beginning, were there any Indigenous communities involved in that, or?
So we did have Enoch Cree Nation was involved in some of our work, and we also had the Métis Nation. I believe Métis Nation. I believe it's number 4 in Alberta. I might have that wrong, but we had the Métis Nation involved as well.
Yeah, just a quick question about, so I know you spoke about how a lot of this is in the planning stage right now, and you were starting to roll out some of your programs into the neighborhood level, but because of COVID, that was all kind of pushed back a bit. So when do you think for your team, some of the plans and programs you've developed, when do you foresee them maybe during COVID? Like what's the scene during COVID and post-COVID? Like what is your forecast for the future on some of these actually turning into like action items?
Right. Again, great questions you all are having. So initially when COVID hit, we had a bunch of information. We were ready to roll out. We were starting our workshop planning for how we'd target maybe the most at-risk neighborhoods or that type of thing. And then when COVID hit, basically we had to stop all engagement and information being put out. They were just putting out COVID information. So I would say it's only been the recent months that we've been allowed to kind of pick that up again. And so in a bit of the transition that went on just with all of the pandemic response kind of hecticness, we lost some of the work we had been doing. And so we actually have to start rebuilding some of it. So we are starting that again. And then we actually had planned to hold some of these Green League workshops I mentioned earlier, just online in November. But unfortunately, we just weren't able to get enough people registered. So we postponed them to the new year, and we'll have to do a bit of a more a bigger, I guess, advertisement of that program. But yeah, so I think it's so much of it is kind of up in the air still for us, unfortunately. Alberta is not in a great spot right now for COVID cases. So I think right now we're just kind of going to plan everything and see if we can at least do some of this stuff virtually in the winter next year, and then from there see. And I think what really will happen is we're going to pilot these Green League workshops virtually, see how they work virtually, and then if we can, we might start the community planning, but in a virtual space. But we want to kind of see how it works first. So yeah, it's still a little bit unknown at this point, I guess.
In a hypothetical situation, if you were given the keys to the city, what would be one change you would make in terms of Edmonton's climate change engagement or policies?
Oh, that's a really good question. One change I would make. I would somehow, I think, work towards that culture shift we were talking about earlier, and just trying to, I guess, change Edmonton's historically built form a little bit. I don't mean historically like historical buildings. I mean like, you know, the legacy infrastructure that we're left with. We've got lots of really big lanes of, you know, multi-lane roads, that type of stuff. And I would try to somehow make more of an active transportation and yeah, I guess more of an urban environment. Like Edmonton's kind of interesting because it's like, you know, we're a small city and we're just starting to kind of become a bigger city. And so I feel like we're kind of in a bit of that transition, and I would maybe work towards helping, I guess, catalyze that transition. Yeah, I don't know. That's a really good question. I feel like it's probably, yeah, probably several things that could be done.
Yeah, it seems similar to what we face here in Hamilton. Lots of small changes need to be added up to big ones.
Right.
So just another question. So in your experience, how do you what would be your advice to for us, like the city of Hamilton, to start implementing some of the initiatives and programs that the city of Edmonton has done?
Or anything else that you've learned while trying to while creating the plan that would be good for a city that's just starting out to know.
Right. I would say honestly, in this is to identify those champions, the ones internal to the city organization of who you're going to be working with, council champions, community champions. I do think having people that can really advocate for and champion this work is huge. So I think that would be a big start. I also think too, and this is I think too, is just being a bit realistic about what you can accomplish. You know, we all have these really big aspirations and you want to change the world, right, overnight. And it's and it can get really discouraging when it's, oh, right, I can't actually influence, how California's drought is going to impact our food supply system, right? So I think even just like being a bit realistic about what you can influence, while still having those big aspirations, but like I think it's just easy to get really discouraged when, like you were saying before, Henry, is that it's a lot of small steps, right? Small changes, and just not getting discouraged by what feels like incremental change when those incremental changes might maybe do add up to transformational changes.
I was wondering, what is what is Edmonton's biggest environmental asset in terms of possibly policy or a structure or anything that is created or that was created or is capitalized in Edmonton?
Great question. I'm going to say our river valley, and that's partly because we have a river valley bylaw that really limits development in the river valley. Of course, we have development, our water treatment plant, for example, and obviously like bridges and stuff, but it really tries to keep it kind of as natural, I guess, as possible. And it's a big wildlife corridor as well. There's lots of kind of indigenous plants that grow there, so you can go and you can pick Saskatoons and that kind of stuff. So I would say that's one of the biggest environmental assets. Also, our biodiversity group has done some really cool work with wildlife underpasses and overpasses for so we have like a provincial ring road around the city, but they've done some cool work with like the wildlife passages there. So I'd say that's a big thing. I'd say those are some of the ones that come to mind.
So it's protected by law, so nobody can go in and develop there. Was there any cleanup you had to do at any point in Edmonton's history of the river valley?
Yes, and there's definitely still some, I guess, legacies there. So, historically there was a landfill kind of right along the river valley, and so it's still like buried there, you know what I mean? So there definitely is. And also there was some coal mining actually that happened on our river valley, this, a long time ago. But I think there's still maybe some leftover stuff there. So yes, there definitely is some cleanup to do. And speaking of cleanup, you reminded me though, we have another really cool program. We have a brownfield grant program, and it basically, it helps developers to get grant money to remediate contaminated sites, and then they can build on these underutilized lots, and there's the tax uplift, so then the tax uplift ends up paying for the grant to remediate. So that's another kind of cool. And then obviously you're also helping the environment because you're cleaning up some of these the typically old fueling stations, that type of stuff. So that's another kind of, when you said clean up, I just thought of that one.
Thank you so much, Danielle, for spending your morning talking to us. We were really excited that you were coming in to share with us some of your experience working with the City of Edmonton.
And I guess just thank you. This was really fun, and sorry if I talk too much. I can talk for a long time about this work.
Thanks for listening to this episode of CityCast. In this episode, Danielle talked about the unique challenges that Edmonton faces with regards to climate change. What do you think are some of the unique challenges we face here in Hamilton? Email us your thoughts on citycast@citylabsir.org. To keep up with what we're doing, follow us on our social media accounts on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram @CityLABSIR. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you soon with another episode of CityCast.